Hello YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about an important aspect of the method of philosophy, and this is the appeal to intuition. Intuition has a very significant role in how philosophy is done, but a number of people have worried whether intuitions are a legitimate source of evidence. So first of all, it's worth starting by examining a few classic philosophical arguments so we can see just how how intuitions are used. One of the big questions in philosophy is, what is knowledge? And the traditional answer, which is often said to go back to Plato, is that knowledge is justified true belief. That seems pretty plausible. But then in the early 60s, Edmund Gettier comes along and presents a rather bizarre example which challenges this. And examples like these have come to be known as Gettier cases. So here's one of Gettier's examples. Suppose that Smith has just done a job interview and he's done pretty well, but a short while later he's contacted by the president of the company and told that unfortunately the job is going to go to another candidate, Jones. So Smith believes Jones will get the job. Now for some reason, who knows why, Smith has just counted the coins in Jones's pocket. Or maybe he's watched Jones count the coins on his pocket. Anyway, he sees that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. So he also believes Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. And these two propositions entail the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. So Smith believes this, and it looks like his belief is justified. But now imagine that, unbeknownst to Smith, Jones has just been hit by a truck and killed. Now, so Jones isn't going to get the job. The job is instead going to Smith. But also imagine that, unknown to Smith, he himself also has 10 coins in his pocket. So Smith believes that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. This belief is true because Smith will get the job and Smith has 10 coins in his pocket. Furthermore, this belief is justified. We've seen that Smith had a perfectly good reason to arrive at this belief. Smith has justified true belief that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Because it follows directly from two beliefs that Smith has good evidence for. And yet, says Gettier, we don't want to say that this counts as knowledge. Intuitively, Smith does not know that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. Now this is a very stupid example for many, many reasons, but the point is that we have a case here where a person has justified true belief, but the justification and the truth come apart in such a way that the belief doesn't count as knowledge. A much simpler example, which makes the same point, is suppose you look at a clock and it says 3:30, and it really is 3:30. So you have justified true belief that it's 3:30, but actually the clock had stopped. Just by luck, you looked at it as it displayed the correct time. Again, intuitively we would say that's not knowledge. You don't know that it's 3:30. This procedure is known as the method of cases. We have a particular philosophical theory, say the theory that knowledge is justified true belief, and then we test that theory against our intuitions about real or hypothetical cases. In this case then, the argument goes something like this: Smith has justified true belief that P, but our intuition is that Smith doesn't know that P, and it follows that knowledge is not justified true belief. The essential piece of evidence here is the intuition. So the first question is, well, what do we mean by intuition? Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of debate about what exactly intuitions are, but generally speaking, we can treat them as sort of pre-reflective or pre-theoretical judgments. When we consider Smith's situation, it just immediately strikes us that Smith doesn't know that Smith doesn't know that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. This isn't an inference from some sort of theory, at least we're not consciously inferring it from a theory. Also, intuitions are often quite strongly held. It seems very obvious that Smith doesn't know that P. It seems so obvious that philosophers have rarely felt the need to justify it. So, in these respects, intuition is rather like perception. Intuitions and perceptions just impose themselves on us independently of the theories we hold, and it often seems obvious that they are accurate. So we have the strong intuition that Smith doesn't have knowledge, and that challenges the justified true belief account. This is a standard method in philosophy. Another example is utilitarianism, is the theory that the right action is whatever one maximizes happiness. And one of the main ways that people criticize utilitarianism is coming up with cases where an action maximizes happiness, but intuitively it wouldn't be the right thing to do. For example, suppose a judge could prevent riots that would cause many deaths by convicting an innocent man. Maybe there's a tense political situation in the country and an innocent man has been used as a scapegoat. The judge knows that he's innocent, but people are rioting, people are killing each other over his conviction. We might say it would actually just maximize happiness to convict him. But we have the strong intuition that this would be the wrong thing to do. And that's used as an argument against utilitarianism. Or consider philosophy of mind. The physicalist claim that consciousness is a purely physical phenomenon. Well, Frank Jackson's Mary's Room argument is a challenge to this. Imagine a brilliant scientist who's locked in a black and white room, and also her skin presumably is black and white, so she's never seen a colour before. But she specialises in vision, and she knows all of the physical facts about colour vision. She can describe in perfect detail the physical processes that go on when somebody sees a colour. Intuitively, there's still something that Mary doesn't know. She doesn't know what it's like to experience colour. If she were to leave the room, she'd learn something new. She'd learn what it's like to see red. So Mary knows all the physical facts about colour experience, but Mary doesn't know everything there is to know about colour experience. Again, this is justified by our intuition. So we conclude that there are non-physical facts. In general then, if a theory is in accord with our intuitions, that's evidence in support of a theory. If a theory violates our intuitions, that's evidence against it. In fact, philosophers may treat this as conclusive evidence against it. For the theory that F is X, well, if you generate a case where intuitively F is not X, we refute that theory. It's worth noting an interesting comparison with empirical science here. Philosophy is generally treated as a sort of armchair discipline. Philosophers don't go out and perform experiments. But the logic of philosophy seems to be quite similar to the logic of science. Scientists test their theories against observations. Intuitions in philosophy play the role that observation plays in science. Philosophers can work from the armchair because intuitions just come into your mind. You don't need to perform an experiment to get an intuition. But in terms of its logical structure, we might think that actually they seem to be quite similar. Now, a problem with all of this is that a number of philosophers have argued that intuitions are unsuitable as evidence. We shouldn't appeal to intuition to evaluate competing theories. So let's look at some of the sceptical arguments against intuition. One point that's worth raising at the start is that any sceptical argument against intuition should not apply to perception. We're asking in this video, are there any special problems facing intuition in particular? Now, of course, many arguments have been proposed for radical skepticism, that would undermine not just intuition, but all potential sources of knowledge. That's beside the point here. We want to ask, is there something wrong with intuition specifically? So we need an argument against intuition that doesn't apply to perception or to other sources of knowledge that we do trust. So a first concern is that we know that intuitions in general are often wrong. Consider people's intuitions about the future. A good case here is the recent EU referendum in the UK, where it seemed that almost everybody on both sides expected that Remain would win. Now, there was no real justification for this intuition. If you looked at the polls, they all showed that it was very, very close, fluctuating around 50-50. And yet, at least in my experience, there was a general feeling that, well, of course the status quo will win. And actually, I remember that even on the night of the vote, Nigel Farage, who was a prominent Leave campaigner, before the results came in, he sort of gave this rather depressed concession speech that yes, it looks like Remain have won, but then the results came through and it turned out it was the Leavers who won. So people were just wrong, right? A lot of people were simply incorrect, and it looks like that was based on their intuitions. Or consider intuitions about the character of other people based on first impressions. Sometimes we meet somebody and we just don't like them, we don't get on, and it then turns out that actually they're perfectly fine. We misjudged them. Another really good example are intuitions about probability. Humans are very bad at thinking about probability, and we go wrong in our judgments all the time. A famous example is the gambler's fallacy. Suppose you flip a fair coin 10 times and it comes up heads each time. Now, you're about to flip it again, and you ask, what's the probability of getting a heads this time? Many people expect that the probability will be very low, because you've just had a long run of heads, so if it's a fair coin, you must be due for a tails, right? Well, no, that's just wrong. Every time you flip a coin, the probability of getting heads is 50-50, at least if it's a fair coin, right? If it's a fair coin, each flip is independent of the previous flip, so it makes no difference how many heads you've had before. It's always 50-50. Even when intuitions strike us as being necessarily true, they sometimes turn out to be wrong. Consider nothing can be red and green all over at the same time. This has sometimes been cited as philosophers as an example of an uncontroversial necessary truth, but if you look up research on impossible colours, it turns out that there are certain experimental contexts where people report the impression of seeing a shape that's red and green all over. This research is controversial, but maybe we're just wrong. Maybe things can have two colours at once. Maybe a better example is the development of geometry. Many people thought for centuries that Euclidean geometry was necessarily true, but then in the 1800s non-Euclidean geometries were developed, and today our best scientific theories tell us that space itself has a non-Euclidean structure. So, intuition in general is highly unreliable, and that means that philosophical intuitions are likely to be unreliable as well. Now, of course, one obvious worry about this kind of argument is, well, perception is misleading, right? We're all familiar with perceptual illusions, so wouldn't this just lead to radical skepticism? Well, I think there are a couple of points to say in response to this. The first is that it does seem like intuition goes wrong at a far higher rate than perception does. Perception is, in just normal everyday circumstances, basically accurate. But when we think about intuitions about the future, intuitions about people's character and about probability, these are everyday phenomena, and yet we're completely mistaken very often in these cases. We don't have perceptual illusions. So perception isn't misleading, it seems, at the same kind of rate that intuition is. And another point is that with perception we have various techniques for identifying circumstances where it will lead us astray. We know that optical illusions occur in specific circumstances, and this allows us to specify places where perception is untrustworthy. So under strange lighting conditions we don't trust our colour judgments, or if we're looking at a very distant object we don't trust judgments of shape and size. And can the same be said for intuition? Can we distinguish those intuitions that are good from those that are likely to be misleading? Well, a limited defence of intuition is given by Jennifer Nagel in her article Intuitions and Experiments. And she focuses on intuitions about Gettier cases in epistemology. Now notice that these intuitions concern whether or not a person has knowledge. And knowledge is a mental state, or at least involves mental states insofar as it involves true belief. Nagel's suggestion is that we can rely on these intuitions because they arise from our more general skill of mind reading. Now, by mind reading, I don't mean anything psychic or paranormal. Rather, the point is that all humans are able to predict and to understand the behaviour of other people. And we do this by attributing mental states to them. If we know that Frank's house has been burgled, we expect that Frank will be angry about the moral violation, and Frank will be sad about the loss of his possessions. This attribution of mental states is a very widespread skill, and part of this involves attributing epistemic states to people. So suppose Frank is moving house and I'm helping him pack up his things. Let's say we both put all his DVDs in box A. Frank leaves the room and for some reason, maybe just to mess with him, I decide to move all his DVDs to box B. Well, now I will attribute a false belief to Frank. Frank will falsely believe that the DVDs are in box A, and he'll be confused if he looks in there and sees that they're missing. Obviously, there are entire professions like magic that rely on our ability to attribute epistemic states accurately. So similarly then, intuitions about Gettier cases are, according to Nagel, ordinary mind-reading intuitions. And since our mind-reading skills are in general highly reliable, our intuitions in Gettier cases should also be trustworthy. So this is, I think, quite an interesting suggestion, although of course it only applies to Gettier cases specifically. It doesn't offer anything like a general defence of the philosophical method. And I think it's kind of hard to see how similar things could be said for moral intuitions, intuitions about the mind, intuitions about metaphysics, and so on. This seems to only really apply to intuitions in some cases in epistemology. So a broader defence of intuition, which is suggested by Alvin Goldman, is that most appeals to intuition involve what Goldman calls application intuitions. These are intuitions about how certain cases are to be classified. We ask, for example, in the case of Smith, does Smith have knowledge? Does Smith's epistemic state fall under the classification knowledge? Goldman suggests that these intuitions may have a better epistemic status than others. Now, what's interesting about application intuitions is that these are the intuitions philosophers used when engaged in conceptual analysis. Many of the big questions in philosophy are about these structure and logical implications of our concepts. With Gettier cases, what epistemologists are doing is asking, what is knowledge? That's not an empirical question. It's not a question about the nature of the world. We just want to understand the concept of knowledge. You might compare this with something like the philosophy of time. Prima facie, that seems to be a metaphysical question. In that case, when you read the philosophy of time, it looks like philosophers are asking about the actual nature of time, right? How time actually works in the world. And for that reason, they will often appeal to the empirical sciences and so on. Our common concept of time isn't really so important here. Especially because our common sense understanding of time is likely to be mistaken in various ways. So in that case, it's Goldman's view of intuitions wouldn't save those intuitions. Those are not going to be application intuitions. But our intuitions about Gettier cases are application intuitions. So of course this does reduce the role of intuitions in philosophy. Another example is Jackson's Mary's Room argument, right? That's an argument that's prima facie about the world. It's not just an analysis of concepts. So limiting philosophy to application intuitions would require some reform. But perhaps we might think that's reasonable. Okay, a second concern with intuitions raised by Robert Cummins is that intuitions have no means of independent calibration. Consider Galileo. When Galileo turned his telescope to the skies, he revealed all sorts of phenomena that challenged the contemporary theories. And you might have asked Galileo, well, how do you know that the telescope gives us a reliable picture of the sky? And the answer is pretty obvious. It's because we can point the telescope at distant terrestrial objects, and then we can walk up to those objects and check what the telescope shows against what we actually see. So our access to terrestrial objects is independent of the telescope. We can look at these objects directly without using the telescope. And so we can use these to calibrate the telescope. If we show that the telescope reliably depicts terrestrial objects, then we can trust that it's reliable for celestial objects as well. And the trouble is, there's no way of doing this with intuition. We ask people for their intuitions about Gettier cases. We want to know whether Gettier cases are cases of knowledge. But we can only trust these intuitions if we have some independent way of showing that the what we might call the knowledge intuition generator is reliable. But how might we do this? It looks like, according to Cummins anyway, intuitions just can't be calibrated, and that would mean we shouldn't rely on them. Now, one response to this is to say that actually some intuitions can be calibrated. So recall Jennifer Nagel's defense of Gettier intuitions. Her thought is that these intuitions are just a product of standard mind-reading ability. So consider this hypothetical study. Let's say we get participants to view videos of people in various situations, and we ask the participants what mental states those people are experiencing. Well, we can then ask the people in those videos to confirm whether the participants were correct. And if the participants' judgments of mental states are generally correct, that would provide independent calibration of mind-reading intuitions, which would then show that we can trust at least the Gettier intuitions. Now, of course, it's very difficult to see how to do this with intuitions more generally, but I just raise this here just to sort of point out that actually there may be cases where we can calibrate intuition, because asking people what their own mental states are, that doesn't seem to depend on intuition. In that case, you're just getting a report of somebody about what they're experiencing or what they had experienced in the past. Anyway, the second response to this calibration argument is that we also can't calibrate other sources of knowledge such as perception and memory. Suppose I say on the basis of perception that there's a computer in front of me. Well, how do I check this? One thing I could do is ask other people, and they might confirm it. They might say, yes, there's a computer in front of you. But they're going to be appealing to perception as well, right? They're going to be using their own perception to confirm what I say I'm seeing. So, that would not be independent calibration of perception. Another option, of course, is to use some sort of scientific instrument, in order to detect the computer in front of me. But obviously, in order to read the results of any instrument, I need to use perception. There's any method we have for checking or calibrating perception will itself rely on perception. The same thing is the case, it seems, with memory. If I say on the basis of memory that I ate a chocolate bar 10 minutes ago, how could you check this? Well, we might try to check it by consulting a CCTV camera, for example. But ultimately that also depends on memory, because you're relying on your knowledge of how CCTV cameras work, and that was something you learned in the past. It just seems like if we go with this argument, it's going to land us into a radical skepticism. And remember, the question here is there something wrong with intuitions in particular? In fact, it's a general way of putting this argument is as follows. Cummins' objection is we can't rely on intuition unless it's calibrated by some independent source of evidence X. But then X itself will need to be calibrated by an independent source Y, and Y will need to be calibrated by an independent source, and so on. We're off on an infinite regress. The point is that certain sources of knowledge have to be taken as basic or foundational. So why shouldn't we treat intuitions as basic in the same way? Alvin Goldman suggests that Cummins is onto something here, but he suggests a weaker condition on any source of evidence. He says that we can appeal to a source of evidence when we are not justified in taking the source to be unreliable. So we don't have to show that intuition can be calibrated by an independent source. It's enough that we lack any reasons to be skeptical of intuition. So from this point of view then, this then just brings us back to the other objections against intuition. Okay, I'm going to continue this. I'm going to look at some more objections to intuition shortly, but that's all for now. Thanks for watching.